1, 2, 3.
Hello and welcome to Green Queens, the perfect podcast for imperfect environmentalists. We're your hosts, sustainability and climate presenters Imogen and Abby, and this is your guilt-free guide to living a little greener. So adjust your crowns, let's get green. So today's guest is a very exciting guest for one of two reasons. Reason one being, Imogen, would you like to share why?
She is, in fact, my sister.
But more than that, the reason we actually got her on the podcast is that she has been working for an organisation for many, many years that have been collating some fascinating research and stats and information on the impact of shopping secondhand and the knock-on effects that is having on first-hand fashion, which is mega because it's so difficult. It's been so difficult up until this point to be able to actually quantify that, hasn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And I think, you know, the temptation with a podcast like this is that we can speak about the secondhand fashion market from our own experience of it.
Yeah.
But I think even in some of the conversations we've had over the past few weeks, we've definitely said, well, we can't actually provide like the parent lens on this. We definitely can't provide the male perspective on this. So it's really useful to speak to Olivia May, who can give us that, you know, the data behind this and actually share, well, what is actually going on across the board, all different types of brands, all different types of consumers. She is so knowledgeable. And
she's like a proper grown-up.
She is a proper grown-up, but I will say she is a proper grown-up who is also just so incredibly fun. Like, if you want organised fun, she is your woman. But also she's just an absolutely remarkable human being. And I'm going to share this nugget with you because perhaps it will expose the difference between my sister and I. So she was head girl of our school growing up. I only ever made deputy head girl.
Right.
So she is the brains in our family.
And you are the beauty. No, she's also beautiful. But I sense a level of animosity where that still is something that impacts you in your relationship. You never quite got there.
I never got quite there. And you know what? Dora, if you're listening, she was a fantastic head girl. She really deserved it. And she still really exudes head girl qualities. So, you know, I'm not bitter, I'm over it. It's taken me a few years, but I'm there.
So from deputy head girl and what was I? Just a kid. I just went to school. I don't even think we had head girls. Or if we did, I certainly wasn't it. So from my deputy head girl and I, welcome in head girl Olivia May to Green Queens.
She is going to hate that. But we've done it now. It's recorded.
This happened. Going out there.
Well, we are absolutely delighted to welcome Olivia May onto the podcast. I'm a bit nervous about this one because, well, for two reasons. A, I'm in Australia and it's very late and I have very few brain cells that are functioning on all cylinders. And two, because Olivia is my sister. And so I feel like I'm, you know, having my homework marked and checked. So I'm on my best behaviour. But aside from being my sister, you are also really, really phenomenal in what you do. You have a job which, when we speak to our dad, he definitely can't describe what it is that you do. So maybe for his benefit, aside from anyone else's, you should kick us off by saying who you are and what you do.
Thanks, I will do. And it's just such a pleasure to be here. So as Imogen said, I'm Olivia May and I work for a consulting firm called OC&C Strategy Consultants, which is a very grand title for an industry that basically helps other businesses do business better. And our work takes on three main forms. So we will work directly with businesses to help them solve a specific problem or a challenge they might be encountering or a particular growth avenue they want to explore. We work with investors who are looking to invest in those businesses to help to tell them if it's a good or bad idea. And then we also have a bunch of pro bono clients that we work with to basically support them with any challenges they might be facing. And we do that obviously on an uncharged basis. And relevant to this conversation, one of those partners is WRAP, which is an NGO that focuses on minimizing waste in the textile sector.
That sounds like a grown-up job.
It is quite a grown-up job, you know, and I actually started it straight out of university and I I was like, I'm not grown up enough to do this job. And now 13 years later, I finally feel like maybe I'm just about grown up enough to do the job.
But also, when you did your interview, I remember this, and this has just popped into my brain as we've been talking about it. When you did that interview, you had mumps. And so you don't even remember that interview really. And also you were like absolutely mortified of having mumps. You were like constantly just holding one side of your face. You were determined to go to all the 21st that we had at that time.
Oh my gosh, I had so many job interviews, so many 21st, and this giant lump on my face. And fortunately, OC&C still gave me a job, which I can't believe. Maybe they felt sorry for me. But either way,
The
they
lumps
gave me the
sealed the
job, and I've
deal.
been
Yeah.
there ever since. Yeah.
Yeah. And every time you were like, is it obvious? And I was like, it is, but it won't be
It is.
forever.
It's a full growth on the side of your face. Yeah.
But what has brought us to you in this particular scenario is that you have collated loads of research that you've been doing in the retail space, and particularly in the secondhand market. And there are just so many extraordinary insights, and we really, really wanted to delve into some of those because I think they just unearth some fascinating threads of conversation with regards to threads of conversation, pun intended. But threads of where the future of fashion could be going, what we expect from the secondhand market, and what's really driving, that growth in the secondhand market as well. So could you kind of give us a whistle-stop tour as to what this curation or collation of research is, and what it was intended to do?
Yeah. Okay. So at OC&C, we work in lots of different sectors, but I work specifically in consumer and retail. And so we have been working directly with retailers and particularly fashion brands who are really trying to grapple with what their sustainability strategy ought to be, how they need to be facing head on into secondhand fashion, and then also working with investors who are looking to invest in fashion businesses and also into circularity. So we have all these different bits of research and information that we're grappling with at any one time. And what we've done is bring that together to build a view of, okay, what is the state of play in the secondhand fashion market at the moment? How big do we think that's going to get? And then crucially, what do we think that's going to mean for the first-hand fashion brands out there? How can they be grappling with this challenge? And what do they need to be thinking about in the context of a landscape that is dramatically changing?
I mean, how do you even begin to look at something like this? Because, we've been talking about secondhand fashion for ages, and it has been difficult to quantify the impact it's actually having. So I can imagine just scratching the surface on starting to look at things like that. It's just a minefield. Like, where did you begin? How long have you been doing it?
I mean, we've been grappling with this topic for years and years and years now. And I guess it's been really gratifying over the time I've been in consulting that sustainability and circularity as a topic has shifted from being part of the corporate social responsibility agenda to being front and center part of a business's strategy. And that's been really exciting to be part of that transition. But we have been having conversations on this for years, but it's only really been in the last 5 years that we've actually started really digging into it and doing very detailed analysis. So this most recent tranche of work, it calls upon a few different sources. We did some very, very detailed market analysis to really understand the actual kind of size and shape and segmentation of the secondhand market. And that was through a combination of market data sources, interviews with experts, and then a really big tranche of consumer research to understand how consumers are spending their money on what and through what channels. And that's what we really brought together here. We did also work a little bit with RAP in producing this piece of research, and they have excellent data looking at where basically flows of textiles move through the fashion ecosystem. How much is going into secondhand, how much is going into wastage, how much is going into landfill. And so we had some of that data also feed into this piece of research.
So then you've got this body of work, and I think it's people like Vinted, Depop, eBay, Vestia Collective, all those sorts of online secondhand retailers. Secondhand retailers? Is that what I mean to say? Yes, it is.
Yeah.
What are some of those key things that have emerged from that, and perhaps what are some of the things that are really surprising?
Okay. So I guess at a headline level, we quantified the second-hand fashion market to be worth a whopping £7 billion in the UK. So that is £7 billion worth of transacted value on second-hand garments. So this is not a market that can be ignored at all. Um, Online represents about half of that spend now. So the Vinteds, the eBays, the Depops, they have totally transformed the size and composition of the market. And they are growing in aggregate at over 25% a year. So they are basically doubling in size every kind of 3 or 4 years. So this market is very big, it's in high growth. And one of the really interesting things is, as the online portion of the market has grown, it's also had a halo benefit on the offline portion. So the charity shops, the thrift stores, etc., are also growing because there's been a general destigmatization of buying your clothes secondhand. And we'll come back to that in a bit, because there has been some nuance that the charity segment in particular has struggled with. Um, so underpinning that big chunky market is a whole load of consumers who are now really actively buying and selling across secondhand channels. So what our research showed us was, in the UK, about 30% of consumers have bought or sold or both online in the last year. And many of those are doing that on a very, very regular basis. And you see the statistics, particularly for Vinted, that they are so good of getting customers in, getting them keeping checking the website, getting them to come back. So on average, consumers who sell or buy secondhand are spending around £200 a year at the moment on that. So again, it's a kind of sizable portion of their sort of fashion budget. And again, those numbers are growing really, really rapidly. There's more and more people kind of coming into the channel every year. And then there's also more people spending more money within that. So obviously the implications of that big change on a fashion industry, which has historically been powered by consumers buying more and more garments firsthand, is really, really profound.
And I think the thing that really got me there was something that I haven't thought about was the ability for apps like Vinted to draw you back in. Subconsciously, obviously, that is something that I have noticed. And I always say to people that are not really sure, don't really know how to get started with sites like Vinted, but particularly with Vinted, that the algorithm is so good. The things it suggests for me are amazing. And that is so addictive, because you never know. It's a bit like kind of the TK Maxx. Like, you kind of got to go on it to see what you're going to find, because if you're not looking at it, you won't get there and you won't find it. So I
Yeah.
wonder, what have you been able to quantify the impact that has had on, let's say, an app a bit like maybe ASOS, where again there's so much choice that people might sit and spend an hour a couple of times a week, maybe even more, just scrolling. Have you been able to look at whether people are there for, like, those apps are struggling?
Yes, I mean, and you've hit the nail on the head there, Abby, because that's exactly what we've seen across the market. We have seen that any historic growth that the established first-hand fashion brands might have anticipated to get
Yeah.
over the last 5 years has shifted to secondhand. So their volumes are pretty flat, or in lots of cases, really quite stagnant. Whereas we're seeing more and more volume go into secondhand. Um, and you're absolutely right that idea of kind of treasure hunting and finding a bargain and finding that great thing at a really compelling price is what is just getting people to Vinted and then getting them coming back. And we see that actually that's much more of a draw for people than the sustainability angle, at least in the first instance. You know, it tends to be, I can get a great bargain, or I can make a few pounds on the side by selling something. I can find some real hidden gems. And then the third factor tends to be, and this is good for the environment, kind of tick. I feel good about myself.
Guilt-free shopping.
Guilt free,
Yeah.
exactly.
But the sustainability thing is so fascinating, because initially when I saw that, it was the tertiary, or like third in the list, benefit of shopping secondhand, I was like, oh, that's kind of disappointing. And then you're like, well, is it really, if points 1 and 2, finding a bargain and finding those treasures, are actually preventing stuff from going to landfill and building that
Mm,
mentality of a more like sustainable mindset, and then therefore it's kind of a happy outcome. But I also
yeah.
feel, you know, there's the other aspect that's kind of slightly addictive of, if you are selling as well as buying, you might be making those transactions, but they're basically feeling like magic money because your credit stays within the platform. And I feel like that's a super smart way to increase the number of transactions.
Completely. And actually, lots of the online secondhand marketplaces we've talked about have really good overlap between buyers and sellers, but Vinted is by far the best. And actually, if you think about what's super smart about the model they've made, it's all come from a place of making it easy to sell.
Yeah.
Make it easy to sell, then you build up the inventory, and then the buyers come. And then so that overlap between buyers and sellers, and exactly as you described, that the majority of credit is kept on Vinted. So I sell something, I make 10 quid, and then I'll use that to buy something. So it's a really smart way of locking customers in and really engendering amazing loyalty to the platform.
And meanwhile, having a user experience that is kind of like a dating app, apart from it's not people, it's old jumpers.
It's like old but barely worn jumpers that I would happily acquire myself.
But I think the other thing that's really struck me is going through is that the majority of listings are still fast fashion brands. And you see that really, really clearly in the sort of the research that you've pulled together. Why? I mean, that is curious to me because the transaction value on those, like the number of sort of t-shirts that you see for sort of £1.50, for example, it that's quite a confusing mechanism, really. Can you sort of unpick some of that?
Yeah, of course. So, as part of our analysis, we did what's called a web scrape of a load of different online secondhand platforms, including Vinted. So, we pulled thousands and thousands and thousands of listings to give us a sense of the most listed brands, the most popular brands, the fastest selling brands, et cetera, on these platforms. And overall, when you look at listings, i.e., what I can possibly buy on Vinted, the shares basically reflect the broader first-hand market. So if I've got a high volume of first-hand, I've probably got a high volume listed on Vinted, which is quite logical. It tends to be quite fragmented. So no single brand has more than 5% of listings. And it broadly falls into two camps. So you've got the value fast fashion brands like Shein, Primark, Pretty Little Thing, New Look. They're around 15 to 20% of listings. And then you've got a second camp, which is more the kind of mass or mid-market priced fashion brands like Zara, H&M, Next, M&S, River Island, and they're about 15% of listings. The interesting dynamic is then when you look at what actually consumers purchased, it looks a little bit different. So those fast fashion brands actually drop down the list and those mid-market brands jump up because the value fashion brands are actually kind of less popular. And that comes down to two reasons. They generally are of a quality and a kind of durability level that is inherently less resellable, exactly to your point, that if I buy a t-shirt for 8 quid, it's probably not going to be of a quality that's sufficient to then give it another life with another consumer. And then secondly, it relates explicitly to that price point that actually as soon as you are putting something up on Vinted that becomes near to the kind of the shipping cost, the economics of it just become meaningless. So unless you bundle them up, I'm less likely to buy it. So, Next and M&S are the two most popular brands on Vinted in terms of what's purchased. And that's because they have this really good trade-off between price, quality, value for money that really works much better in a resale environment.
Do you think there's also an element of people looking at brands like Shein and Primark and thinking, okay, I can get it on Vinted for £1.50 plus the, I don't know, £2.50, £3 delivery, or I can just go in the store and spend an extra couple of quid and get it brand new?
I think there is a bit, I think there is a bit of that. And because the economics and the finances of this are the principal motivator for consumers, they are always trading it up against what's the full price of this garment. And then I like to hope, but we haven't been able to prove this out in the research. So this is my hope rather than fact, that also that there is a little bit of I would rather buy M&S because that's a bit more guilt free on Vinted than if I buy into Shein on Vinted. But it's always quite difficult to say exactly how much that features into the decision making process.
Yeah, I guess it's hard because if the vast majority of shoppers on these apps or that are shopping secondhand aren't doing it for the green credentials anyway, they're doing it for the bargain and for the just generally feeling like they've found an absolute steal, then it's hard to know, isn't it? I get asked a lot about people saying, like, was back at my sister's at the weekend, and I just wanted to borrow some things. You know, sometimes you just want to spruce your wardrobe up a bit. She was like, "Oh, well, I've got some new T-shirts, but like, you're not going to like the brands." And I said, I don't care because I'm not buying them. And no, okay, so I wouldn't necessarily promote that, but I'm borrowing it. So I think the same narrative when it comes to buying secondhand, while not ideal, that for example, you're looking at a dress on Vinted that's a brand like Pretty Little Thing, it's still preventing it from going in landfill. And if you think you will
100%.
wear it and love it for a long time, whether you'll be able to, because whether the quality will be good enough, I guess is a different argument. But it is still potentially better for it to be kept in, like,
yeah, I agree.
kept in
And the
circularity.
analogy I think is quite good is, you know, if you're encouraging children to make sure they go to school, whether they go to school because they love maths or they love football is kind of irrelevant. They're still going to school. And that's sort of how I think about it with secondhand. It's like, I totally get, particularly in the current climate that we're in, that actually getting a bargain is the number one motivator here. But how brilliant that then that is also doing good for the environment, reducing wastage, giving a garment another new lease of life. And, you know, even if it's not the intended consequence, it's a brilliant unintended consequence.
Do you think that, for example, if people are aware that they will struggle to sell a Pretty Little Thing jumper secondhand, but they will probably get decent whack from Marks and Spencer's jumper secondhand, that gradually, have you seen any of this, that actually that might then decline the really super fast fashion brands in terms of like buyer seller mindset?
It's a really good point. And actually, what we have seen across the broader fashion market is a bit of a shift towards what I would describe as consumers buying smarter. And smarter here can mean a few different things. It can mean more durable, longer lasting. It can mean better at surviving the wash. It can mean more innovative fabric. And then across all of those things, it could mean, and I know I can resell it when I'm done. So actually, when I'm going on M&S and I think, oh gosh, that's a £35 jumper. Actually, no, I'm thinking the net cost is it's a £20 jumper because I know I'll be able to get 15 quid because it's going to last. It's going to keep its color. It's not going to bobble. You know, all of that bit of decision making has fundamentally changed than how you're making choices in the first hand market, which I think is, you know, again, is really for the best.
So what's the consequence then for a fast fashion brand? Because if we're saying that, you know, first-hand fashion is no longer growing year on year, it's a pretty stagnant market. There is a boom in the second-hand market, of which, you know, a lot of that is fast fashion. How can they compete? Because they're not going to increase the quality of their materials, because ultimately they also do need to appeal to a price point of which is totally accessible to loads of people. So what do they need to do to ensure their survival? And are those actions actually compatible with a sustainable mindset?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And I would say it's one of the biggest challenges that we grapple with our clients, because they just basically can't guarantee that their growth is going to come from selling more stuff each year, which has been, you know, their growth engine for the preceding 10 years. And we sort of frame this for them as three options. Option one is hold and defend and basically own being a first-hand brand, because there's obviously a space and a need for them. You've got to have a really clear point of view, and you've got to do something that is fantastically brilliant and better than anything you can get secondhand. But there is an obvious space and home for that. I actually think within that option, we do talk to brands about actually designing better for resale. So thinking about product longevity, because then you're more likely to convert that purchase. So I think that is still front of the brand's minds. The second thing we talk about is around diversification. So as a business, if you're not going to get growth from volume, what revenue streams can you build to get growth? So that could be, I'm going to actually offer new categories that have a smaller resale market. It could be offering new incremental services that my customers might pay for. So repair is a brilliant example, refurbishment in the consumer electronics space. But that could also include things like a styling service, or, things that don't touch upon sustainability. And then there's things like new payment options, which might bring you in some incremental revenue. And then the third sort of camp of actions we talk about is around then competing head on. So are there ways you can either build yourself or partner to create your own circular capabilities, which might be rental, might be resale, might be repair and restoration, or some combination of the three?
I mean, and I don't know if this actually does any. You mentioned Zara being one of the biggest brands on Vinted. Zara do have their own resale on their app. Do you have any info as to how much they actually generate through that?
I don't have
Lip
specific.
service, do you think, or are the brands doing it trying to actually be better?
They are all trying to be better, but in an environment that is incredibly complicated and costly. So basically, any decision that they're trying to make a better sustainable choice comes with extra costs. So recycled fabrics cost a lot more. Near sourcing your supply chain to reduce your carbon impact is way more expensive. The reverse logistics around recycling and resale are very, very complicated and costly. So the economics of doing it yourself are really challenging. H&M's been doing it for the longest and still struggles, basically, certainly from a profit and definitely from a complexity perspective. Where we've seen it be more successful is when there's a really good partner in place. So Lululemon has a part of their website called Like New. Lululemon products massively fall into that camp of like really good quality, really long lasting, innovative fabric. So totally makes sense to do resale. They have a partner called Trove, and Trove actually manage all of the kind of collection of the unwanted garments. They do cleaning and inspection. They do a small amount of repairing, but nothing too complex. And then they'll help then with the resale portion of that. And they've managed to make that economically viable. But we do have to remember that Lululemon's obviously of a price point which enables that as well. So if you are more of a kind of mid or value fashion price point, it's incredibly complicated to do.
Mm. It's so fascinating because, all of these dynamics, this idea that, if you do need to respond to consumers, maybe thinking about that resale market and then upping your quality, that comes at a cost. If you're thinking about having additional services or partnering with people, that also comes at a cost. And then also, if you're investing in that quality, the frequency of transactions in the first-hand market may also be less. So I suppose there's probably quite a big existential question for fashion generally at every single price point, be it fast fashion or, higher end luxury, of are they, in having a more sustainable mindset, do they cannibalize some of their sales? And is that something that they talk about and that they worry about?
It's as in, and what do you mean by cannibalize their sales there?
In that, like, say, for example, if you've got something that is more expensive because the quality is
Oh, right.
higher,
Yeah.
you're less
Yeah.
spending less frequently, or if the quality is then higher such that you can buy it secondhand and it will still be brilliant, then you're losing that first-hand consumer because it exists now in the secondhand market.
Yes, yeah, it's a constant challenge. I often point though to someone like Primark, who has their kind of Primark Cares initiative, which is all focused on improving their full agenda, ESG agenda, not just from an environmental perspective. And they've done a really super job of introducing much more recycled and organic cotton within their mix. And it comes with a price premium. But actually, they've used their volume and their scale to manage that premium on the consumer's behalf. And the appetite from consumers has been really good. And so they are happy to pay £2 extra for a white t-shirt because they know it's going to be better. They trust that Primark have done a good job on their kind of ethical diligence, and it's also not breaking the bank. So it's an increment that actually is still affordable. So I think there are really smart ways that businesses can manage it. But it all comes back to this whole theme that they are still losing volume to secondhand, and to fight that is basically impossible at where the scale of that market is right now.
And I guess you're coming at it as a kind of advisor to these businesses, but I think Imogen and I maybe are thinking, well, that's not a bad thing. We don't need any more clothes. Yes, of course, people will continue to buy, and there will always be a market for fashion. But there are enough clothes on this planet to clothe, I don't know the exact stats off the top of my head, but everybody until, 2080 or something stupid like that. So the fact that we've seen the fashion market, and particularly the fast fashion market, stall and not grow actually is a good thing, is it not?
I mean, it depends whether I'm answering now as me or as advisor to clients. So I think ultimately yes, and I think there was a period of time in the 2010s where the volume growth driven by the incredibly cheap fast fashion brands was kind of sickening. And it was all unnecessary, and it really was quite disposable fashion. It was really the buying the dress for one night out and then I'm never going to wear it again, it's going to end up in landfill. And so I think we are coming out of that, and I think that can only be a good thing for the industry more broadly, and obviously for our environment more generally. When we work with clients, though, these are often brands that have incredibly long heritage on the high street. They still mean a hell of a lot to people. They are giving thousands of people jobs.
Yeah.
So we don't want to get to a situation here where we're just seeing fashion brands completely die. I think we have to reach a place where the first-hand fashion brands and the second-hand platforms can really comfortably coexist, or really work together as effectively as possible, so that they both thrive in a way that is sustainable for them but also for the environment.
And do you think that could change a dynamic in terms of how we consume fashion? For example, in the first-hand sector, maybe there is this shift towards greater quality, sort of the more capsule type wardrobe approach, and the second-hand fashion can be that place to sort of get the one-offs for the party, or the things that can be a little bit more statements that perhaps are a bit more fluid and changeable. Do you think we will see a meaningful shift in where we go to for different types of fashion?
Yeah, and I think that is a really good question, because I think we're seeing a nice shift, and I think you used the word fluid there, Imi, but from disposable fashion to more fluid fashion, or more kind of transitory fashion, which I think has really quite changed behavior. So one of the things our research uncovered was that now any new garment that comes to market is typically resold 2 to 3 times. So that's not just one resale, that might be another resale, and then maybe even another one on top of that. So you're really stretching the lifetimes of these garments, and you're giving 3 people a time of life where they might own that garment. For one person, yes, that could be for literally one weekend at a wedding or one night out. For someone else, it might be one of the favorite things in their wardrobe, but it's that much more kind of fluid um, fluid approach to kind of garment ownership and garment lifetime, which I think is a really, really good thing. But it's a fundamental shift in the way you think about your wardrobe and the clothes that you own. That's quite transformational.
Just on the charity shop note, I know we chatted a lot about online resale. What kind of data have you managed to get from the charity shop side of things? Because I am fascinated in charity shops and whether they have seen the impacts of
Yes.
this.
So the charity shop sector has been a set of interesting and unfortunately kind of competing dynamics. So on the one hand, exactly as we just described, we have seen many more consumers open to shopping for clothes in charity shops, and they love it. And the same thrill you get from the thrifting and treasure hunting experience you get on Vinted, you get that in droves in charity shops. The challenge has been that the best garments are now going to the online channels.
Yeah.
So you're getting basically worse stock going into charity shops that tends to be of a slightly lower price point. So the economics of the charity shops have therefore suffered, which I think is a real shame. And what we definitely don't want to see is charity shops having to exit the high street. So I would always encourage people, when they're thinking about detoxing their wardrobe, can you save aside a few things, a few great things that the charity shop's really going to benefit on, and then the other stuff can go on Vinted, because that quality of garments has definitely reduced since Vinted and Depop and eBay have got so huge.
But while the quality might be reducing, the appetite for people going into the shop and browsing in the first place is increasing. So maybe it's
it's a balancing act. And they are surviving and they do see the benefits of it. And actually the most innovative ones are starting to partner. So they have an eBay shop, and there is one charity that's now on Vinted, and that's going to be an area that they open up. It comes with cost, it comes with complexity, because someone still needs to put those products up on the websites. They still need to then ship them. But I think that's could be a really interesting collaboration between the platforms and the charity sector.
But couldn't that be cool if you uploaded an item to Vinted or whichever platform of choice, and you could say either I want to receive the revenue from this, or I'm happy for it to go to Oxfam or
even 50%.
Yeah. Or toggle it how you want. Yeah, I think that's a brilliant idea.
It's a bit like when you go in to pay and it says, would you like to donate 20% to charity? And everybody's watching you and you're like, yep, sure, yep.
Exactly.
Anyway, we've digressed. I know we mentioned Wrap. You mentioned working with Wrap. They have literally just put like a report out called Displacement Rates Untangled, and looking at like really specific figures around secondhand shopping, but also around repairing and that kind of market. They've worked with brands like Sojo and The Seam, and also eBay and Depop. They've come up with really, really positive figures. And I wonder whether you have seen much overlap with those stats that they've come out with. An example of one is repairing a cotton t-shirt instead of buying a new one will save 7.5 kilograms of CO2, and that's equivalent of ironing for 25 hours. Not that anybody has 25 hours to iron.
Just give it a good shake. It's fine.
Yeah.
Yes, I think our metrics are quite complementary. I can't speak for how Wrap have calculated I think they call it their displacement rate, but it's that idea of basically in buying secondhand, you are both preventing a new garment being created and offsetting the kind of wastage of that garment further down the line. And how does that basically convert into an equivalent first-hand garment being purchased, or kilograms of CO2? We've done some similar research, actually. We did a piece last year in partnership with a forecasting business called Trend Curve. And they basically use loads of different kind of consumer, catwalk, market insight, expert data to predict what trends are going to do. And brands basically buy into this data to give them, so they can demand forecast effectively. So they don't overbuy into Peter Pan collars, because actually next season it's all about the, I don't know,
V-neck.
V-neck, exactly. And so we partnered with them to basically kind of quantify this, and it was very, very similar to what Wrap is saying in terms of the kind of substitutionary effects of overproduction. If actually you can minimize that, if you can shift that into secondhand, the savings are quite phenomenal. And then I think what we also saw in our research, which is very well aligned to Wrap, is that there are a bunch of consumers for whom shopping on Vinted or eBay or Depop is incremental to their broader fashion habits.
So they'll buy it as well as.
Right. But there is a whole host of consumers who are doing it instead of. And it's really interesting, because when we test a brand like Vinted versus first-hand fashion brands, consumers just think of it as a brand. They're not thinking, I want this thing from Zara, so I'll see it if it's on Vinted. Some will, but the majority don't. People are thinking, I want a jumper, I'm going to look on Zara, I'm going to look on Vinted, I'm going to look on M&S, I'm going to look on Shein. So it's just in their repertoire. And so that's where you get those amazing substitutionary effects of actually this is a purchase that was going to go into the first hand that's now very actively going into the second hand.
And do you think that like the rise of whether you've looked into this or not, I don't know. If not, then it's a job. But whether the rise of social media and influencing and people just styling and you just seeing an outfit put together and going, oh, well, that's a pair of pale baggy jeans, some trainers and a black blazer. I'm going to see if I can find that. And you're not even really looking at the brands or where they're from, but
yeah,
that as opposed to what it used to be back in the day, which was, I don't know, my mum getting the Debenhams catalogue through, and that's where you were getting your inspiration from. So therefore you were shopping at Debenhams because the blazer you were looking at was a Debenhams blazer.
Yeah, and I actually think the secondhand platforms have done really amazing collaborations on that like idea of vintage or secondhand styling. And you know, for example, when eBay was a sponsor of Love Island a few years ago, fantastic shift in mentality for everyone, and they were all styled in the evenings and stuff from eBay. That is just brilliant. That just shifts the narrative completely.
Definitely. And also in a way in which it's, you know, this is a podcast called Green Queens. You'd like to think that people listening to it might have a bit of an interest in being a little bit more sustainable, and therefore Vinted, eBay, Depop, Vestia, any of those brands, if you would like to sponsor us, we would be definitely up for a chat. But very cleverly, I think with the Love Island situation, it was almost targeting people that weren't in that mindset. So it's like subconsciously making people think outside the box, which I think is very, very clever and very smart. And I would like to think that that might have had more of a displacement sort of impact.
We're definitely seeing the displacement impact. It's going to continue to be slow because the first-hand market in terms of volume is just completely enormous. You know, we're talking 4 billion garments a year that are still sold. You know, 4 billion garments exist
in the world. 4 billion garments
in the UK.
In the UK,
4
yes,
billion garments are bought each year. Now, almost 1 billion of those garments are secondhand, but you still got 3 billion that are first-hand garments. So this is like a really slow ship to try and fundamentally change, but we can see it changing. The pace of growth of secondhand is the driving force that is changing it.
And this kind of feels like a Green Queens exclusive because of how long you've been looking into this and how little we've been able to actually quantify things. It's absolutely fascinating to be able to like hear it in that way. 4 billion garments a year are sold across the world, and
across
so
the
a quarter of those, across the UK, and a quarter of those, or is that right? Is
Correct.
secondhand? Okay,
yeah,
that is so mind-boggling, but it does sort of really beg the question of, well, okay, if platforms like Vinted want to capture more of their market, they've also got to continue improving and innovating and making their platforms even better. Because, no offense, Vinted, I love Vinted very much, and I know that Liv, you won't be able to say too much because you work with them very closely, but it's not the most chic app to use, I would say, and I feel there's definitely room for improvement.
I think that's one of the brilliant things, right? Because I think even with, you know, a very mature business like Vinted, there is still so much growth to go after. Whether that's like making the user experience much better, exactly as you described, Imi, or whether that's bringing tranches of new customers in who are still a little bit scared of secondhand fashion, or that's stretching up to get more premium and luxury brands involved in fueling that part of the inventory model, or, you know, even are there other categories that you can be integrating in? So actually we see similar secondhand shifts in small homeware or in small consumer goods or electronics or those sorts of things. So I think there's, you know, even though we've seen this amazing growth story and we've already seen this huge fundamental shift in market dynamics, there's still so much further to go, which I think is really, really exciting.
I think what's also really exciting as well is that I get asked a lot, what difference does it make? What, you know, if I'm only having 1 cup of tea a day, what difference does it make? And it's, again, difficult to quantify, but I always do say that, particularly as a consumer, where you put your money is so important. And these businesses will have to adapt if the consumer is deciding that they no longer want to consume in that way. So it makes the future... It's like, what is it? Adapt or die is the saying. So what have you looked at kind of predictions and what you're expecting the future to look like?
Yeah, so it's always a little bit difficult to predict with extreme accuracy these things, but today, as we sort of discussed at the beginning of the conversation, it's around 30% of UK shoppers have bought or sold something online in the last year, and they're spending around £200 a year. We think that could get to about 40 to 50% of UK shoppers within the next 5 years. There's real pockets of consumers today who don't particularly shop secondhand, and particularly not online. And we think they'll be spending about £350 a year on themselves, their kids, maybe a bit on their partner as well. So as a proportion of total fashion budgets, that will represent about 10%. So
Wow.
10% of the UK fashion industry will be in online secondhand, which is huge and cannot be ignored by anyone in the industry.
And what do you think, is there anything that could accelerate that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think a lot of that power sits in the hands of the platforms and apps themselves, depending how they invest their tech dollars, how they innovate, how they continue to think about customer centricity in everything they do. I think if this route of kind of collaboration with first-hand brands really really becomes a meaningful thing, that could be another really important accelerator. And then the other thing that we see very, very directly is that a lot of private investment is now going towards secondhand fashion, consumer to consumer marketplaces, anything that's enabling circularity. So there is a lot of funding that will hopefully support growth as well.
But very critical question, because I know that Abby, you were with your sister over the weekend, maybe swapping some clothes. We have had a tumultuous few years of growing up, of delving into each other's wardrobes. Do you think siblings borrowing each other's clothes and the resentment that can bring, do you think that will change in this new era of secondhand clothes?
So I think I have two responses to that, and they are both like at opposite ends of the spectrum. I think thing one is, I think sharing clothes, buying for a group of friends to enjoy a garment, I think we're going to see a lot more of that. People are so much more open to it, especially for sort of occasion wear or things in your wardrobe you don't wear very often. Think about how that can be shared amongst as many users as possible. So that might minimize the sibling feuds. But then at the other end of the spectrum, I can imagine a scenario. If we were teenagers now, if you wanted to borrow something, I'd be like, well, you can buy it off my Vinted.
Yeah. Or rent it off the rental apps.
Or you rent it off me. Exactly. It's like there's a whole infrastructure to
Transaction.
enable that for me now. So you can hand over the £8 that I'm going to put that up on Vinted for.
On £8.
Invest in things together. Be like, okay, this is a 50 quid thing. Why don't we split it down the middle and then we share it?
And actually we hear a lot about that with particularly people who live in house shares. There's real openness to more sort of like collective buying, knowing that you'll probably sell it on when you move house or something.
Love that.
That is really interesting, and I wish that my husband would be open to that with the things that I would like for my wardrobe. But
hasn't your husband got like size 12 feet? I don't think you're going to be able to share those.
He's also 6'6". There is absolutely nothing they could possibly share.
It's a real shame. I'll keep working on it though. I'm aware that we have been talking for almost an hour, and we could continue to chew you off. But before we wrap up, we have been asking all of our guests this. And I suppose the question is, do you have a sustainability tip that somebody has passed on to you that you would like to pass on to our audience? And I should have warned you about this.
Yeah, because I probably got a million and now I can't think of a good one.
It's like when somebody says, what's your favourite song? And you're like, Bon Jovi.
Name a song. So this I'm going to say as a mother of two small kids, when it comes to anything relating to your kids, you do not need to buy firsthand. Toys, clothes, buggies, there are endless secondhand markets out there for it, because you only need those things for a few months at any one time. So that would be my number one tip to parents out there. And then I would always encourage them within that thought to also donate, to share, to be very open within their community about what they don't need anymore. And then my other one, which again with small kids, in our family, we basically try not to use our car more than once a month. And we're fortunate in that we live in London, so we do have public transport at our disposal, but we always try and make the use of public transport part of the activity we're doing with the kids. So this trip to the soft play is so much more exciting because we're getting the bus, and that's, part of the afternoon, and the kids absolutely love it. And it's just a great way of obviously not using your car, but also kind of making best use of your local public transport networks. I'd always encourage parents to think about that as well.
I love that. I wish that it was still like that as a 31-year-old whose rail card's just about to expire. Damn. Olivia, thank you so much for coming on. I'm well aware of the fact that you probably didn't have any choice because you were hounded by your own sister to come on Green Queens, but we very much appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure to join you both, and I think what you're doing is just fantastic. So hopefully this is the third of many, many more guests that you feature on your episodes.
So Abby, what did you think?
I thought that I can absolutely see why she was head girl, for one. And I can absolutely see how fascinating a job like that would be. Can you imagine going into work every single day and finding such interesting data and information?
Yeah.
Wow.
And also that, and I know that at the end of the day, she is a management consultant. And of course, this is what management consultants do. And I'm sure people have a variety of opinions on, whatever, bias or non-bias on management consultants. Yeah. But the data that she's conducting on this sort of first-hand and second-hand fashion market, she is then speaking to the decision makers in those brands and in those companies. So that stuff is going to manifest as like actual change, which ideally will be better for the first-hand fashion industry and the second-hand fashion industry at the same time. So, she's an influential lady, I will say.
Yeah. And also, like you say, there might be a certain level of bias there, but a stat is a stat, a figure is a figure, a fact is a fact. And we have just, the whole report, which we will link. So if anybody wants to sift through that report and find the information themselves, we'll put a link to it somewhere within the podcast. That's not my job, that's an Imogen job. But yeah, a link will go there so you can look at it. And what I think was great about that is that for the first time in a long time actually shifted to the mindset of the high street. And while we all have our opinions on fashion and particularly fast fashion, and again, it's not necessarily something that we want to be promoting, but there is an argument for the coexistence of those things and, the potential positive impacts that they can have, particularly if they can work with these consultants and adapt, because like we said, adapt or die. And yeah, it's exciting to see that as a consumer, we have managed to change things.
I think that is exactly it. And one of the things that really struck me, it was about how, this is a peer-to-peer platform that Vinted is. Like you as a seller are selling to another fellow human being. You're not selling to some sort of like big organization. And I was thinking about how when it has to be worth it for you to sell something or want to buy something. And if you put something at a certain price point, you will put the effort in to ship it on time or to package it really nicely. And there is this sense that it kind of collectively elevates how we treat our stuff and a little bit each other. So I think they need to coexist. I think it forces us all to respect our clothes in a different kind of way, which is great.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Green Queens.
If you did and you'd like to hear more, we'd be so very grateful if you could subscribe and join the Green group chat for weekly episodes.